Texas does everything large, and this applies to climate change adaptation as well. The state, working with the US Army Corps of Engineers, has proposed a $31 billion coastal barrier, the country's biggest civil engineering project ever, to safeguard Houston and the Texas Gulf Coast from hurricanes and sea level rise. Watch this video to the end to know more about this super billion-dollar project. The Ike Dike Project. The topic is being taken up by the US Congress, where the House of Representatives on June 8 adopted a measure that would authorize the federal government to begin designing the project, which still requires Senate approval. The greatest element of the project is a mammoth $16 billion concrete gate system, nicknamed the Ike Dike, meant to prevent storm surge into Galveston Bay. Other components include levees, pumps, and ecosystem restoration. The Texas coast is both hurricane-prone and unusually susceptible. About 522 million tons of goods transit through the port of Houston each year, according to the Army Corps' Coastal Texas study, and it contains the country's biggest concentration of oil and gas installations. Plans for the project began after Hurricane Ike blew across the region in 2008, killing 68 people and costing $37.6 billion in damage. Hurricane Harvey upstaged Ike in death toll and expense 9 years later. Yet Ike certainly might have been more dangerous if it had produced large petrochemical spills, according to the Houston Chronicle. Still, detractors doubt the efficacy, affordability, and environmental impact of the project, which would permanently change hundreds of miles of shoreline. The proposal comprises natural beach and dune restoration, pumps, levees, a larger seawall, and other obstacles, as well as the gigantic gates in Galveston Bay. The Army Corps has already spent 6 years and over $20 million to create the multi-pronged strategy of defense against storms, floods, and erosion. The sea level along the Texas coastline might rise another 2 feet by 2050, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and severe weather is also anticipated to grow. The Bolivar Roads gate system between Galveston Island and Bolivar Peninsula consists of a number of gates of varied sizes. 2 gates, 650 feet long and 82 feet tall, will stand at the entrance of Galveston Bay, ready to drop when a storm approaches and seal off the waterway to ocean surges from the Gulf of Mexico. Otherwise, warships will go through them, according to the Army Corps news statement. A shallow gate connecting to the Bolivar Peninsula side would enable marine species to securely migrate in and out of the bay. Together, the gates are projected to minimize storm surge by 30% to 60%. The Army Corps thinks they will take 18 years to develop. Not everyone is excited about the plan. Some environmental organizations, including the Sierra Club, oppose the Ike Dike outright. It contends that the spine won't give adequate protection and that it might impair Galveston Bay and the coastal ecosystem. Instead, it's asking for the wholesale departure from places vulnerable by storm surges. But for Merrill, the initiative is the only rational path ahead for an area at peril. This is preventative medicine, he told the Texas A&M Foundation's online magazine. The premise is straightforward. You limit the storm surge at the shore so that you safeguard everyone. Local environmental organizations are afraid the Ike Dike may damage adjacent ecosystems. In an op-ed in the Houston Chronicle, Galveston Bay Foundation President Bob Stokes and then Executive Director of the environmental non-profit Bayou City Waterkeeper, Jordan Matcher, also raised concerns about the project's expense and its unsecured funding, and called for more immediate plans to help stop climate change. Rather than waiting a decade or more for a costly silver bullet solution, there are steps we can take immediately, the authors claimed in the op-ed, and recommended governments to engage in ecosystem restoration and non-structural projects. The discussion about the environmental effect and architecture of the Ike Dike have been eclipsed by the one over its cost, now an estimated $31 billion, and who should carry it. The Gulf Coast Community Protection and Recovery District, a panel Texas Governor Rick Perry formed in 2013, completed a study on how the state might defend against storm surges and formally backed the Ike Dike idea in 2016. Yet, shoring up money for the project has been challenging. Some argue that private enterprise should pay for the safeguards surrounding their own locations rather than forcing taxpayers to foot the expense. The Army Corps of Engineers is working on a study regarding storm surge barriers for the whole Gulf Coast, and until it reaches its results and makes recommendations, government cash likely won't be granted. While it's on the White House's list of national projects to explore, there's been little progress at the federal level at the time. The severity of storm damages. Hurricane Harvey has pummeled Houston for days, and the final toll it will have on the area is yet uncertain. But it's already prompting concerns about what might have been done to properly defend the city. Storms as powerful as Harvey do inescapable harm, but the correct landscape design and infrastructure solutions may limit the destruction if policymakers, engineers, and scientists could agree on what to do. One long languishing project is the Ike Dike, which was suggested following Hurricane Ike in 2008. Still merely a concept over a decade after Houston's last catastrophic flood, the megaproject's tale illustrates why flood infrastructure is increasingly critical and strikingly lacking in many susceptible locations, as experts and policymakers dispute the science and design that drives it. Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans in 2005 and caused an estimated $108 billion in damage, and Superstorm Sandy, which slammed New York and New Jersey in 2012 and caused an estimated $75 billion in damage, were both accompanied by storm surges, in addition to rain and severe wind. So was Hurricane Ike, which swamped Houston and prompted the Ike Dike in 2008. Harvey, on the other hand, did not create a big storm surge when it reached Houston. The flooding was the consequence of torrential rain, though coastal communities nearby did suffer surges. But if the hurricane had been followed by a storm surge in Houston, the impacts would have been considerably more severe and disastrous. Refineries surrounding Galveston Bay and the Houston Ship Channel process 40% of the United States petroleum and half of its jet fuel. Floods might trigger millions of gallons of spilled oil and chemicals. When Hurricane Ike struck the Houston-Galveston region in 2008, it drove a 19-foot storm surge into the Galveston Bay, inflicting $29 billion in damage and over 500,000 gallons of spilled crude oil. Ike had Texas A&M professor Bill Merrill, who is stationed at the university's Galveston campus, thinking about what may be done to safeguard the area in the future. Inspired by the Dutch, who notably erected a network of coastal seawalls, levees, and dikes after a 1953 flood killed over 1,800 people, Merrill suggested the coastal spine, dubbed the Ike Dike, a coastal barrier to block water from entering the bay. Houston isn't the only city adopting Dutch ideas to reduce floods. New York City is developing its own storm surge barrier, or dry line, commonly known as the Big U. The network of berms, disguised as parks, would span over 10 miles of Manhattan's shoreline and boost the elevation of property along the waterfront, absorbing the effect of storm surges and providing much-needed public space, which makes it all the more appealing for politicians. The Ike Dike will reportedly contain bike routes and walking trails, but the design doesn't incorporate a major community component. Yet, even in the Netherlands, which is ahead of the curve with respect to water infrastructure and flood control, policies are altering. Increasingly, the country has moved to make room for the river, or find ways to coexist with more water rather than block it out completely. After all, over the coming decades, sea level rise could render today's most fail-safe infrastructure useless. What's next for the Ike Dike? The Coastal Texas Study is included in the Senate and House versions of the Water Resources Development Act, which incorporates several government activities that need legislative approval. The law will invest in 36 Army Corps studies and approve building of the Ike Dike and 20 other projects. When asked for comment about the Ike Dike, a representative from the Army Corps said in an email that the agency is taking a pause on media interviews for this coastal Texas study while we wait for the congressional approval and authorization process to take place, and referred Construction Dive to its website. Funding for the project would likely be divided 65% from the federal government and 35% from a non-governmental sponsor, according to the feasibility assessment. That means the state might be on the hook for at least $10 billion, an amount that could climb with inflation and rising building expenses during the anticipated 2-decade development timeframe. Details about who would lead construction and what that would involve are in flux, since the idea must still pass a full-floor vote in Congress. If it does pass, the project must compete with other programs for cash. And the Army Corps already has more than $100 billion in backlog. The agency must file a separate request, presumably in the form of numerous appropriation packages, to get the appropriate money. And yeah, that wraps up this episode on Houston's $31 billion Ike Dike Megaproject. Do you like what you just watched? Then give us a big thumbs up and ring the bell to join our notification army. See you again in the next one.